Episode 4.5, Bonus, Humorism and Solidism. Hello, and welcome to this bonus episode of the History of American Food. I have realized that as I try to make sense of American food history, there are going to be topics that are too interesting for me to pass up, but are only tangentially food-related. For those topics, I will do an episode, but it will be an extra and often short. It will contain details that aren't necessary to follow the through line of the podcast, but will add an extra layer of fun trivia. I hope you'll stick around and take a tour of some of the brain furnishings of the past. This first bonus episode covers the medical theories of humorism and solidism, ideas that drove much of 17th century Western European medical treatment. There are two reasons that are driving me to do this. The first is that much of the categorization of food that is coming up leans into these ideas when deciding how food should be sorted. For example, what is children food and why? Humorism and solidism will tell you. The second is that the reasoning used in both of these things lives on as little trivia goblins in the Western mind even today. These ideas are still around in modern food marketing speak. And I'm always interested to see how some ideas linger on long past when they make sense, because we use them without thinking about it, like roll down your window or hang up the phone. See? It's everywhere. The big wheels that drove late medieval European medical ideas, at least the ones people wrote down, go all the way back to at least city-state Greece. Well, likely further, but my earliest sources are from then, so I'm just going to call the 6th century BCE the bottom. The Greeks anchored much of their understanding of the natural world in the idea of 4 elements: water, air, earth, and fire. I know. The Last Airbender, great show. Later, a 5th element, the quintessence, would be added to account for things that operate in the ether, the things that were unaccountable. Anyway, nearly all medical writings of the Greek and Roman states were largely lost in Western Europe when the Western Roman Empire started its hard crash in about the 5th century CE. Except for a few eccentric loners and dedicated religious types and tax collectors, pretty much everyone stopped reading except for a handful of Irish monks. For about 1,000 years, Western Europe was reduced to scrawling with burnt sticks on poorly cured animal hides by the light of oily torches and drafty stone forts. Fortunately, a little around the bend, millions of people in the Islamic caliphates in the eastern and southern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia were still reading and writing and building wide, well-drained roads and keeping libraries. This is where Turkish, Persian, Jewish, and Arab scholars and natural philosophers of the Middle Ages were able to continue to develop and observe the ideas of the 4 elements. Among other things, they used it as a framework to help organize ideas about how the body functioned. Some ideas were pretty sound. Some were ridiculous. There was a definite lack of rigorous testing, and a fair amount of useful knowledge was guarded as trade secrets. For a long while, medical knowledge was personal, observational, and anecdotal. Anyway, as reading picked back up in Western Europe, the work of 2 guys, Galen from 2nd century Turkey and a 10th century Arab, Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, became the best known, or in modern lingo, they had the most journal citations. Their work was developed into what is now known as humoral medicine. If you want to follow along at home, I've posted a handy graphic that I think, ironically, follows the design of those 4-color chemical safety labels. It is in the show notes at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Okay, what are the basics of humoral medicine? It identifies 4 humors or fluids all people contain, and those fluids are associated with the 4 Greek elements. To be healthy, your 4 humors should be in balance. The 4 humors are blood, yellow bile, now considered to be lymphatic fluid or the clear stuff in a healing cut, but it does get gross and yellow when you have an infection. Black bile, the modern interpretation of this is the coagulated blood found in internal bleeding, cancerous growths, and other sick body parts. And phlegm. Yeah, no explanation needed for phlegm. We all know a little too much about coughing these days. Then it takes the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and divides them into 2 pairs, hot and cold, dry and wet. Then this is all assembled together. Each fluid was associated with moods or personality traits along with the 4 elements. Blood was hot and wet and associated with air and a sanguine personality. Generally, this meant you were a healthy, cheery person with energy and a rosy complexion. This was considered good. Yellow bile was hot and dry, associated with fire and a choleric personality. This meant you were bitter, short-tempered, but daring. You often had a sallow, yellow, or greenish complexion. It's not that it was bad, but maybe you should calm down and cheer up. Smile more. Black bile was dry and cold, associated with earth and a melancholic personality. This meant you were lazy or sickly and sad. You had a pale or bluish complexion. The advice was typically, get out of bed, run around. The fact that cancer and black bile were associated means they were onto something, but the suggestions for cures were typically way off. Phlegm was, you guessed it, wet and cold and associated with water. Not bad in the matching game because, yes, being too wet and cold often got you phlegmy. I can hear the shock. It was also associated with reserved behavior, thus the modern term phlegmatic, low spirits, forgetfulness, and white hair. Yeah, good job, I guess. Low spirits and untreated asthma, pneumonia, tuberculosis, or cystic fibrosis. I can see that. Also, old age and chronic lung trouble, those do seem to go together. But again, while the observations were not terrible, the cures were, questionable is a polite word. Anyway, through Solidism, foods would get associated with different humors. If you were low on a given humor, you should eat more of the foods associated with it. And if you had too much of a humor, there were foods you should avoid. For starters, sugar, since it gave one energy, and when heated, it melts and appears to moisten or get wet, it was thought of as sanguine. So if you were lacking in energy, warmth, and general health, sugar was a cure-all. In the 17th and 18th century, there were cooking for invalids sections of cookbooks, and these always included things like syrups, marmalades, fruits and syrups, and strengthening things like broths of meat. They had extracted the sanguine essence from the animals. Later, because these things were associated with the sick and delicate, sugar foods and clear broths were appropriate for delicate people. Like ladies. But if you had a fever and were hot and sweaty, you'd get bled. Clearly, you had too much blood, too much of that sanguine humor. That's why there's all those references to bleeding the patient when someone had a fever. And you should also eat dry and cooling black bile foods like lemon or vinegar if you are too hot and sweaty. So the association of lemonade and shrubs, which are fruity vinegar drinks, were seen as sensible when you were feeling hot and sweaty from either sickness or exertion. If you were hot but dry, you'd be fed phlegmy foods like cucumbers, melons, fish, things that are cold and wet or associated with water. On the other hand, if you were too phlegmy, hot, dry foods, yellow bile foods were the ticket. salt, mustard, bitter things. The thing is that the determination of what foods carried what humors were often this sort of chicken and egg kind of thing. There was no particular system. People decided through their own free associations of what went where. And oftentimes associations might be manufactured after the fact for things that seem to fit naturally together. It would sort of explain, oh, the humors of these things balance each other. That's why cucumbers and vinegar go together so well. As I'm sure you understand, this particular sidetrack leads off into deep and mysterious depths, but I'm going to stop there. This is only meant to be a really basic background for some of the terminology that's going to turn up in future episodes, but may have gone out of fashion. I hope this was an enjoyable detour. Show notes for this episode, including the nifty diagram, will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. And the link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio, THOA Food, and in the show description.